What's going on, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to AgitProp, short for agitative propaganda. I'm your host, Hasan Piker, coming to you live from the den of sin, the epicenter of cultural imperialism. I'm, of course, referring to sunny California, Los Angeles. We have an awesome show ready for you guys today. I spent a long time with Dan, our producer Dan, which you will get to see actually in person for once. All this past weekend and for hours late into the night last night to put together, because it's a jam-packed back-to-back show, two very special guests. At 12:30, I'll be joined by Michael Brooks of the Michael Brooks Show and also the Majority Report. You guys might be familiar with him because he is also a professional impressionist. We're gonna have an impression off. Later, we're going to talk about Lula, his favorite topic, of course, and Exiting the Vampire Castle by Mark Fisher, and why at a time when right-wing radicalization is happening all around the world and right-wing fascist governments are propping up left and right, we on the left, unfortunately, have to kind of let go of some forms of purity testing, especially bourgeois purity testing, in an effort to organize more effectively. We're also going to be talking about the Bernie Sanders criminal justice plan and how MSNBC covered it and how ridiculous it was. I'm going to be malding a little bit for the TYT fans. Malding means I'm mad and balding. That's a Twitch meme. If you want to find out more about those Twitch memes, you go to twitch.tv/Hasanabi, where I'm live every day after 4 p.m. Pacific. Now, we're also going to be talking about in the first hour why anti-fascism is good. I'm going to get to that briefly, but before that, I'm going to do a quick plug about the second hour, which is behind a paywall, but that is going to be with Mehdi Hasan, one of my favorite journalists, favorite commentators on the planet, a person I share a name with. He is the better Hasan. I'm going to be talking to him about Islam, his personal transformation from being a relatively more conservative Muslim to a progressive Muslim, and how neoliberal thinkers and neoliberal pundits like Bill Maher and Sam Harris routinely engage in Islamophobia, and how their ridiculous criticism of Islam is monolithic, and how that actually impacts and how that plays into the hands of Muslim fundamentalists and extremists in different parts of the world. So a lot of stuff to cover. We're finally going to talk about Hong Kong protests as well. So if there are any tankies in the audience right now, I suggest you tune out from that portion, because I will say that the Hong Kong protests are good, and that I don't think that police violence is a good thing, even if it's being done at the interest of a supposedly communist nation. So let's just get started, okay? So, Antifa, good. Every little thing that you might want to know about anti-fascism will hopefully be explained to you in the next 15 minutes. Now, ahead of the far-right rally that was being conducted or being organized in Portland, Donald Trump tweeted out a warning to Antifa, where he did not address the members of the alt-right gathering at the Portland rally, but he did say he's considering designating Antifa an organization of terror. Now, this is something that liberals and conservatives alike kind of agree on, where they think anti-fascism is bad, Antifa is bad. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not, okay? It's not bad, it's good. First and foremost, though, let's take a look at the rally really quickly.
We heard some violent Nazi chuds. We're going to get together in the park because they like to make YouTube videos of themselves looking really tough. And we thought, how tough can they look if you got unicorns in the background and banana suits? So that's why my wife, Eunice Unicorn, and me, Edwin Unicorn, came down.
So that was the Antifa CEO / president, Edwin Unicorn. I'm of course joking, okay? Let's just get started. All right, so anti-fascism is an ideology. It's a movement, it's an action, it's not a membership, it's not an organization, there's no organizational structure, there's no hierarchy, you can't join Antifa, you can't be the CEO of Antifa. So whenever someone says that like they are a part of Antifa, or they're a part of a club, or they're a member of Antifa, know that they're probably either lying to you or trolling, or they're a right-wing disinformation agent. But the reason why I started off with Edwin Unicorn there is because Antifa is not just about the black bloc. It's not just about mass protesters going up to Donald Trump supporters and beating them with bike locks or whatever, despite how hard conservative media tries to portray it in that fashion, okay? It's just about opposing fascism and doing whatever is necessary to oppose fascism. Now, Some forms of Antifa are just like the unicorn guy that I showed you, that just want to simply protest against and counter-organize against fascist organizing in different areas. There are other forms of anti-fascist protests that also take a more militant approach that do not exclude violence. So, that doesn't mean that like violence is a part of their ideology, or that doesn't mean that they are an inherently violent group. It just means that if push comes to shove, in an effort to defend their own communities, some members of Antifa or some Antifa, anti-fascist organizers will not rule out potential violence. But having said that, isn't it rather suspicious that whenever we talk about violent political ideologies, we always say left wing is so violent, they're throwing milkshakes, they have cement in their milkshakes, and it's crazy, and they're punching Trump supporters, and it's just a bunch of people filling up their diapers, freaking out. I'm of course referencing like Jake Tapper and whatnot. And yet, for some weird reason, white supremacist terror has a lot more numbers on the board. In 2019, for example, domestic extremists killed at least 50 people in the United States. 2019 was the 4th deadliest year on record for domestic extremist-related killings since 1970. The extremist-related murders in 2018 were overwhelmingly, and this might shock you, linked to right-wing extremists. Every one of the perpetrators had ties to at least one right-wing extremist movement, although one had recently switched to supporting Islamist extremism. So, really weird, really suspicious that, you have 0 kills on the one hand as far as anti-fascists go, and then you have a bunch of kills on the other hand. All of the kills, as a matter of fact, with the exception of one, when it comes to right-wing, far-right, anti-government extremism. Really weird that the overwhelming focus, however, is almost always on how violent Antifa is, and they constantly talk about potential violence that might come later down the line. Why are we talking about potential violence that might come later down the line when we already have real violence linked to white supremacist domestic terror, like the case of El Paso? Really strange. Anyway, so what is anti-fascism? Let's talk about that. So anti-fascism is an ideology that opposes fascism and tries to fight back against the spreading of fascist ideology. Like I mentioned already, it is an action, it's not an organization, there's no membership, and it's decentralized and only exists when fascism exists. Contrary to popular boomer memes, like this one that focuses exclusively on the fact that people are wearing masks, Antifa doesn't even always wear masks. For example, in the latest counter-protest that we're gonna take a look at against Patriot Prayer in Portland, anti-fascist organization featured trade unions. They featured a group of colorful banana suit wearing people. They also featured this unicorn guy that we mentioned earlier. But then there was also the mask wearing black bloc. Now this is the most popular part of anti-fascism, or the most heavily popularized part of anti-fascism, even though they make up a small number of anti-fascists that are organizing at any given place. The example that I want to show you guys in the B-roll is the black bloc surrounding the famous Proud Boy who is there specifically to agitate. And the Proud Boy I'm of course referring to is Alan Swinney. So that behemoth right there is Alan Swinney, and if you can look closely, there are people around him that are ensuring that Alan Swinney does not present a threat to the other peaceful counter-protesters there. And that's precisely the reason that they're there. They're not there to like beat up Alan Swinney specifically, but they're there to ensure that Alan Swinney does not beat anyone else up. Now, it's more often than not, it's a defensive stance that they take around actual violent white supremacists to ensure protection to counter-protesters. Also, a lot of fascists will purposely agitate, like the example that I just used, and they'll walk into crowds full of anti-fascist counter-protesters, they'll taunt them, they'll try to scare them, they'll try to shove them and push them around, knowing full well that the police will end up protecting them. And if you think I'm lying, here are some Proud Boy chats that were leaked showing us how they use violence. Now, there is a Huffington Post article that discusses how members are talking about how they might use violence against the commies they'll meet in the streets, which police officers might be sympathetic to them, how they'll raise funding to fly out their long-distance compatriots, and how they'll bait protesters into throwing the first punch so that they can claim self-defense. But also, if you look at the text message exchanges that were leaked to Huffington Post, you'll realize that they're not necessarily interested in a peaceful confrontation. They're not necessarily interested in free speech, and that this is precisely why there is a necessity for a more militant defense force that will protect the anti-fascist protesters, because they know that historically police have oftentimes sided with the fascist protesters. If you look at the Canal Street riots, for example, or if you look at like the Swedish anti-fascist protests, more often than not, historically, the police officers are usually defending the fascists against the counter-fascist protesters. This happened in Charlottesville as well, most famously, where Heather Heyer, an anti-fascist protester, was killed by James Fields, a neo-Nazi who drove thousands of miles to Charlottesville to go and murder as many commies as he possibly could. Now, what's also interesting, aside from the fact that the prominent Proud Boys that I just showed you were planning assaults, is that even the person who organized the event, Joe Biggs, was recently banned from Twitter for making death threats and was reportedly visited by the FBI agents asking about his violent postings. Biggs' social media activity included a video showing off a spiked bat he said he was bringing and a post saying he was setting up a torture chamber in his home. There was a famous video that was aired on Fox that Andy No distributed. There was a hammer that was highlighted and shown as being thrown by an Antifa protester at a Proud Boy. But if you look at the full video of the hammer incident, however, it shows that it was a member of the American Guard who brought the weapon to the rally. The hammer was then taken by an Antifa protester after an American Guard member attempted to bludgeon them with it during a fight outside of the American Guard bus. Now, you might be asking, what is the American Guard, Hasan? That's crazy. Oh, turns out, if you look at ADL reports, the American Guard was an offshoot of the Sons of Odin white supremacist group. So, you know, those guys there that most people are defending without realizing that they're defending are white supremacists who brought hammers. I wonder why they brought hammers to a peaceful demonstration. I wonder why a white nationalist group would bring hammers to a peaceful demonstration. It almost feels like their intentions are not as pure as these stupid liberals and dishonest conservatives make it seem out to be, okay? Anyway, let's keep going. So fascism is a longer conversation that we can get into. The American Guard is a good example of this, and crypto fascism is absolutely a conversation that we're going to get into because it requires like a longer, more comprehensive approach where I will describe to you why people hide that they're fascists or why people hide that they're racist, because they know that if you're outed as a Nazi, then even liberals will no longer take you seriously. Although that conversation is changing in in recent years. But fascism is a form of radical authoritarian right-wing ultranationalism which focuses on power, militarism, and the control for the benefit of an in-group. This in-group, out-group dynamic is incredibly important for fascism because that is the significant difference between anti-fascism and fascism. Anti-fascists are upset at people who want to organize, fascists who want to organize in their communities, because fascism always will lead to violence. Whereas if you want to stop anti-fascism from happening, anti-fascist organization from happening, you just have a very simple choice. Don't be a fascist. Stop being a fascist. Stop going to fascist demonstrations. Stop being a part of the very fine people on both sides if one of the sides is screaming blood and soil, or if one of the sides is bringing bats and hammers to beat up people that in a town that they don't even live in. Don't forget, a lot of times the fascists are organizing. They have membership structures in their organizations. They are linked back to like white supremacist murderers. Sons of Odin is a perfect example, or the American Guard is a perfect example, which has members linked to 9 kills, like 9 hate crimes that ended up in murders in recent years. So there is an element of choice there. You can choose not to be a fascist, but for a fascist, their ultimate goal is the wholesale eradication of certain subsects of the population. You can't choose not to be Jewish. You can't choose not to be gay. You can't choose not to be black, but you can choose not to be a racist dingus. This is the main difference between fascism and anti-fascism. And the reason why I want to mention this, even though it sounds so simple, is because a lot of people end up conflating the terms, and a lot of liberals even start saying stuff like anti-fascism is the real fascism. And that is playing into the hands of the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the white nationalists, the white identitarians, the numerous different rebrands that you hear for the same old violent ideologies. Stop playing into the hands of fascists, stop defending fascists, and admit that anti-fascism is good, and understand that there might be certain elements in fascist mobilization, which I will talk about right now, that can end up being violent, but violence is a part of all politics. What upsets you or what offends you when we talk about violence is not necessarily the bike lock hitting the head of a white nationalist or whatever, but it's actually the fact that that violence is outside of the norm. Now consider the Portland protests. There were many different violent arrests in the hands of the police. The police also use long-range acoustic devices, which were considered for war zones originally. These are military surplus equipment that the Portland police is freely using on citizens. That's violence. That is state violence. But no one ever considers that to be violent behavior because it's not outside of the norm. So oftentimes what you consider to be violent behavior or violent actions is just simply violent actions outside of what is expected. So another example of this I can use is the structural violence of poverty. The violence that if you don't go to work every single day, that violence that operates under capitalism, if you don't go to work every single day, you will not be able to put food on your table and you will potentially die. You won't be able to pay your rent and you'll get evicted. That is structural violence. State violence is another sort of violence that I just mentioned, when police officers will violently arrest you or use tear gas to disperse a crowd. That's still violence. It's just not the kind of violence that you would consider to be outside of the norm. So when you see a protester beating up an old man, for example, with a big beard on the Laura Ingraham show on Fox News, and you say, wow, these anti-fascists sure are crazy, right? You should probably look a little bit further into that situation. Because more often than not, that old man happens to be a 3%er, he happens to have an extended baton, and he happens to be walking directly towards an LGBT couple that he is interested in beating up. So, I think in that circumstance, violently defending that couple or violently defending marginalized people in your communities from white supremacists doesn't seem all that unreasonable, especially when the state, the kind of violence that we are all accustomed to believing is normal, fails to defend those marginalized communities. This is precisely why a small subsection of anti-fascist organization will not rule out violence as a last resort. That doesn't mean that they are violent from the jump. Now, the other forms of anti-fascist organizing are, they normally happen before fascist demonstrations occur. If a fascist is coming to your town, like Richard Spencer, for example, a Nazi, is coming to your town and wants to organize a rally, what anti-fascists will do is try to subvert or derail or stop that organizing from happening by calling up hotels to make sure that these Nazis don't actually get a place to stay, or calling up the location in which this person can be speaking and telling them, this is ridiculous, this person's a Nazi, this person's ideas are inherently violent, and this will make this community less safe. So we want to stop this from happening. Those are all anti-fascist actions that you can take. As a matter of fact, that's the overwhelming majority of anti-fascist action. Anti-fascist action starts in derailing fascist organizations and ends at the final stage by using violence if necessary in a defensive way. Now, am I excusing all sorts of violence from the left? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not all violence obviously is equal, and in chaotic moments like protests, some people might actually end up getting hurt on accident. I'm not excusing this behavior. This is precisely why anti-fascists are very careful with where and when they apply this sort of violence. Anyway, we talked about this, I think we covered this as best as possible. They're telling me to go into the next topic. So let's just move on to the next topic. But I just want to leave you off with this one very important note, okay? Stop being a sucker. Stop being fooled by right-wingers. Stop being too much of a liberal to realize that like all forms of political action inherently have violence associated with them. And it's just all dependent on who the victims of that violence are or why they are receiving that violence, okay? I'm not making like a moral qualifier on this. I'm just saying realize that all manner of politics is about a distribution of violence and distribution of wealth and power.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.